At last, I can undo my greatest failure!
He means you, Crash.
First things first, we must dedicate this one to Mel Winkler, who sadly passed away last year and was the original voice actor of Aku Aku, and it's only right he gets a mention as this game is dedicated to him. Hi guys, and welcome back to SwitchUp. A big thanks to my friend over at Switch Corner, Alex, for helping hook us up with this review copy. Today we're going to strip the game apart, have a look at the performance, the visuals on Nintendo Switch, frame rates, the resolution at which it runs in both modes, as well as more nerdy things like frame pacing, shadows, draw distance, texture resolution, and all that good stuff that I so enjoy. At the end of the video, I'll go over my impressions of the game based on the time I've played on the Switch version so far. If you enjoy the content, then do consider sticking around. Remember, we give away a free Nintendo Switch game each and every month. With that said, how does Crash perform on the Nintendo Switch? Well, let's find out. The developers made a bold promise with this one, aiming for fully native resolution in both docked and handheld at 1080p docked and 720p handheld with a 30 FPS locked out frame rate. And I'll be darned if they haven't managed to achieve it. As you can see from the frame rate footage, it is absolutely locked out to 30. The only dip you'll notice is upon death, when assets have to be quickly reloaded and stored in memory, and you may notice a minor stutter for a second before it locks out at 30 once again. In play, the input latency is on point, and your button presses are registered instantly, allowing for tight control of Crash or his companion Coco. And it really is mightily impressive that Toys for Bob have done such a good job of bringing this one across. Not only is it a recent release, but in terms of visual effects, everything seems to be, for the most part, intact. When we look at the frame rates over in handheld then, while we can't do frame rate graphs, we can see that, true enough, the 30 FPS seems to be maintained. And once again, input latency is very good, with no noticeable delay at all. This is running on the Unreal 4 engine, which we've seen used in many different places on the Switch, and to varying degrees of success. While Crash 4 might be a slightly less taxing title than an open world experience, there's still a lot going on in terms of visual effects. So let's look at the image quality. The first thing to note, and which really caught my eye, was the inclusion of real-time reflections. Now yes, these may be reflective maps and not entirely real-time, just taking the assets that are most obviously noticeable to the eye, but it's still really impressive, and there's zero impact on performance. The water ripples move around you without nary a ripple on that frame rate. Praise the sun. The environments are all suitably detailed, with texture resolution holding up well enough on this version. Clearly they've opted for an anti-aliasing technique, potentially post-processing to reduce on the amount of performance drop, and this has resulted on the outside edges of most objects in the world remaining nice and crispy. That being said, it does also have the impact of giving the image a slightly blurrier look, but it's well within acceptable ranges, very similar to something like the Spyro Reignited Trilogy port, which also did an excellent job. One thing of note with Crash 4 as regards visual quality are the amount of moving objects on screen at any one time. Even when stood still, there'll be rotating blades or swinging pendulums, and once again I was really happy to see that even in the far distance, these are all being rendered at 30 FPS and remain intact. Something that has a slightly closer to camera level of detail bias has to be the dynamic lighting. Things like lighting casting a shadow onto your character Crash, and then that shadow being placed upon the ground, are all of very good quality, and in fact these look like they might actually be soft shadows, which just looks a lot better. But as far as dynamic lights go, you'll also find a number of those within the Switch version. They just won't show up until you're that little bit closer. When in motion, it's not something you're going to notice, but it's one of the few sacrifices or perhaps tweaks that they've had to make to get it running so well. As you'd expect, the Unreal 4 engine handles smoke and other lighting effects very well, and again there's no drop in performance. One thing that we love about the series is how the backgrounds are handled. If this was a 2D game, you'd describe it as parallax, but it's almost like a 3D parallax effect, whereby a canyon might be seen in the background or some other distant objects, each lit in a different way to give a real sense of depth. It's actually really quite smart how they've handled some of the more taxing visual effects by fading them in and out when the player might not notice, or at the edges of the screen. You'll see in the shadows during this scene, just as the camera goes to turn, you'll notice them fade out. Or should I say, you probably wouldn't notice them fade out, and it's only when you move forwards and backwards that you'll see the change in that level of detail draw distance. The overall image quality then is top drawer, and the longer you play, the more small details you'll notice that potentially could have been completely lost if the porting process was handled poorly. Distant shadows cast by your player, distant shadows cast by other objects in the world and static scenery, and even high quality distant assets largely still remain intact. It really is one of the best ports I've seen on Switch, and no offense to Apex Legends, it's a real juxtaposition to that game in almost every sense as regards visual quality. Then there's the load times. I measured load times across about 6 or 7 different stages, and let's just say they are very good. Initial load times into a level generally were under 20 seconds, and when you die it's almost instantaneous, bar that minor drop in performance for a second. Before we look at controls, let's have a little look at the audio of the game. And just like with the rest of what's been on offer so far, it seems like they've done an excellent job keeping everything high fidelity. All the sound effects are in place. I didn't notice any audio issues at all. There's no doubt this could have been a first-party Nintendo title in the visuals and performance department. The game is only a 10GB download. Now I say only because there's an incredible amount of content here, as well as post-game content involving essentially mirror images of all of the worlds with a retro visual over the top. There are a number of multiplayer modes as well to enjoy with up to 4 people, such as Checkpoint, which sees you running through, checkpoints. But unfortunately at this time of night here in the UK, it was a bit difficult to get some partners online. The Switch will use your Wi-Fi connection to establish its leaderboards, and it will also let you know if you're attempting a speedrun if you drop Wi-Fi connection with a red cross over a Wi-Fi symbol, but it won't stop you playing. It just means that that time won't be potentially recorded properly. The game is obviously available physically and is £44.99 on Switch, or your regional equivalent. But if you buy digitally on Switch, then you will get the totally tubular skins for Crash and Coco. So that's enticing. I'll finish up then with my thoughts of Crash 4. It's about time to give you my hot take on it so far. Well, it's been a while since I played a fully fledged Crash game, with the original PSX Crash games probably being my last completions of the series. We had the Insane Trilogy, which was okay, but yeah, for me it was all about OG Crash until now. Crash 4, I'm amazed, didn't do better at launch than it did. It did much worse in terms of sales numbers than the Insane Trilogy, and in my opinion, it's a much better game. There's no denying that the difficulty seems to fluctuate a little bit, going from some brutal stages to some much easier ones and then back again, but you know what, I think that's by design. It gives the player a respite and reminds them of why they're enjoying the platforming before it sends you back in and absolutely hands your ass to you on a plate. It's been a pleasure to play. I love the switching mechanic between Coco going back and doing different stages, the different movesets they both have, including Coco's grappling hook. This is platforming at its purest form, and I think it's a brilliant game. The boss fights are excellent, well designed and actually really clever, and it just looks brilliant. Yep, for me, if I wasn't a reviewer, I'd be picking this game up for sure to add to the ever-growing backlog. This is brilliant. Be aware that it is a very difficult game, and that if you want to go after all of those collectibles and find all the fruit, then that's where the potential frustration will come in, because some of them are grim. But look, you don't have to do that. You can just work your way through the levels, doing the retro stuff that they've thrown in there as well, which is very cool, and having a really good, proper platform experience. So in conclusion, they have smashed Crash 4 on the Nintendo Switch in the best possible way. What a relief. Once again, a big thanks to Alex from Switch Corner and to the developer for the reviewed copy. Let me know down in the comments, are you impressed with this port? Is it one you're considering? And as always, a big thanks for watching the channel. If you enjoy, then consider sticking around, and a thanks to our patrons who support us each and every month. As always, for all things Switch, all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers guys, see ya!